Hello, folks. Welcome to Holding On with Holder, where I talk to interesting people about interesting topics. My name is Steve Holder, and I am your host. My guest this evening is Jan Canty, psychologist, talented author, and hostess of a great podcast called Domino Effect of MURDER. Welcome, Jan.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
Thank you for being here. So tell us about your background and how would you describe yourself?
My background, I'm a native of Detroit. I'm a psychologist and I do photography, gardening. I have a podcast, Domino Effect of MURDER, and I've written a book called A Life Divided. How would I describe myself? I guess I'm a pretty persistent and stubborn person. If I put my mind to something and set a goal, I do it. I've done many triathlons. I'm battling cancer and I'm going to beat it. I have traveled extensively throughout the world. COVID put a stop to that, as well as my health, but I'd like to finish my bucket list, which is all the continents. I have 2 more to go.
Okay.
And when I do travel internationally, I like to go really, really off the beaten path. I don't stay in places where there's a lot of other Americans or in high poshy hotels or anything like that. I want to embed myself in the country and learn what I can, which I think is a wonderful opportunity. And I wish more people would actually do it. You come home to your own culture and you see it new. It's different. It's a learning experience.
Yeah.
It has shaped my life, actually.
Yeah. So what was it like growing up in Detroit?
I had a great childhood.
Did you?
I have great family. My parents were outstanding. They're both deceased now. They lived a long life, though. They died in their 90s. I'm a twin. I had an older brother who raced 57 Chevys and his 32 hot rod and his motorcycles and all that. Very car-oriented family. We had a lot of art projects. We also traveled extensively by car throughout the United States. I was on softball teams with uniforms way back in the 60s. We had about 20 children per block, so that if you wanted to have a tournament of any kind, it was very easy to gather up a lot of teams. We had competitions for raking leaves to see who could have the biggest bonfire. We had a woods to play in. I had a terrific childhood. I wouldn't trade it for the world. And then but it was very conventional, very traditional. And I wanted something different than my neighbors. I didn't want to be a housewife. I didn't want to just go to high school, get married and have children and settle down. I never wanted that, but I didn't have any role models, to even teachers, that would encourage me to do a different route. So that was tough. And my parents were not enthusiastic about college either. They never went to college. Their emphasis was just do a good job, whatever it is, and do it ethically, do it hard work, and we need everybody. So it doesn't matter what you do. If you become a waitress, if you become a teacher, whatever, just do an honest job. And you don't have to go to college to do that. So they were not going to help me. And the teachers didn't help me. The school counselor didn't help me. He just, it was a time, an era in which women were not encouraged to go to college. So I had to find my footing and grapple with that. So I bumbled along. I went to community college, which I did well in. I loved it. It was such a refreshing break from high school, which I hated. I hated high school. To me, it was just busy work and spitwads and cliques, and it was a waste of my time. I did not like it at all. But I loved college, and I got a scholarship, which allowed me to go to a 4-year university, which is how I paid my way, because I was living in downtown Detroit by myself in an $80 a month, $80 a month apartment, a 3-story walk up in an area that wasn't safe. I put my bed on the floor away from the windows because of the gunfire outside. And I eventually sold my car to make tuition one semester. And then so I couldn't even afford the bus fare. So I started walking back and forth to school, but I was very determined to finish, and I did. And then I got married and he encouraged me to go on. So I got my master's and my doctoral, and then I went for a postdoctoral fellowship after that. So I finally finished at age 29 and became a psychologist. And it was in that year that my life was flipped upside down when my husband was murdered. And I had to basically start over because the media just hounded me, and I left. And it was hard because I love Detroit. I I loved the diversity, the tempo, the grassroots feeling about the town, the can-do atmosphere, the car races. I mean, the restaurants, I could go on. The music, oh, I love the music. And I used to babysit for, when I was a child, 12, 13 years old, I used to babysit for people that knew the owner of Motown. So I got to get all the little freebies and learn the story behind each up and coming performer. And so I was very embedded in the city. My grandfather lived downtown too, and I spent time at his place. So I was very much an inner city kind of kid, and I loved it. And it was very hard giving it up, but I felt like I had to if I was ever going to get my wits about me afterwards. So I left and reinvented myself, and here I am.
Okay. So you have a PhD in psychology, correct?
Yes, correct.
Now, do you still see patients as a psychologist?
No, after I'm still working though. After my husband was killed, I did have a private practice at the time. It was just starting because I just finished my postdoctoral fellowship. But my energy I never had the sufficient energy and concentration I needed after that to really do an honest job of clinical work after that. It takes a lot of mental stamina and energy to do that kind of work. And I never felt I had it again. So I went into academic work instead and taught graduate school. And I loved that too. And that led to photography and international travel because my specialty was cross-cultural psychotherapy. So I thought if I'm going to teach cross-cultural psychotherapy, I'd better travel extensively so I can bring stories back to my students. And if I'm going to do that, why not do photography at the same time so I can show them what I'm talking about? So that took me in that direction. And I found that very gratifying. But at the present time, I don't do that either. I work for the federal government I've been doing it for about 15 years. I do psychiatric disability claims evaluations. It's not a very interesting job, but I can do it from home, from a computer. And that meshed well with trying to recover from cancer because I could work from home. So I'm still working, although I am taking a break. I'm on break right now from work, which is my own doing for the summer. And it's the first break I've taken since I was 16 and I turned 70 next week. So I figure I'm overdue.
Yeah. Now, would you consider yourself an overachiever?
I consider myself a curious person. I'm curious about a lot of things and I get excited and I want to learn all I can about them. And I feel like I put a lot of pressure on myself to make as much use of my time as I can. It feels so finite, whether it's traveling or gardening or psychology or podcasting. I mean, there's so many directions to go in. And when I throw myself into something, I don't do it superficially. I really want to learn it. Yeah. And I'm always curious. I'm never bored. I get tired, but we live in a time where you have so many options, and I feel fortunate about that.
Yeah. A lot of therapy is done online now. Do you think that's just as effective as in person?
No, I think it makes it more available.
Yeah.
That's certainly a good thing. Yeah. But there's many negatives. One of it would be security breaches. Another would be you don't know who else is in the room. Yeah. Another would be sometimes, this is going to sound weird, but sometimes the odor of a patient is important. You can't get that on the internet. For example, I had a patient one time who was very moody, and it didn't seem like bipolar disorder. And then I smelled a consistent sweetness about him. And I asked him if he'd ever been checked out for diabetes. And he said, no. Turns out he was diabetic. Well, you're not going to pick that up on the internet. Yeah. So, but I don't think it's a trend you can fight. I think we're dealing with a population in their 30s who've grown up with the internet pretty much, and they're adapted to it and they don't know the difference. So it's here to stay, but it's not something I would. As a matter of fact, I gave up teaching over the internet issue because they wanted to go all online. And I said, no, that's not how I want to teach. I spend too much time online as it is. I'm not going to do this online either. And I did not think it was a very effective way to go. The plus side, though, is it makes it more available, especially to rural areas. You can't knock that. Although rural reception is very bad. When you look at the school problems of COVID-19, those kids did not have the same effectiveness of teaching as urban kids because of the lousy internet, and it's still not corrected. It's
Yeah.
been promised by politicians since dirt, but it never happens.
Well, you know how politicians are and promises, right?
Yeah. What do you want to hear? I'll tell you.
Yeah. So what got you really interested in psychology? I mean, why psychology? Why not psychiatry or medicine or something else that you could help people? Why psychology?
Well, medicine never, I mean, the body interested me, but I was never interested in the idea of doing physical exams and hands-on work with people. Um, Also, I did not want the really superficial contact you have with people as a physician. By that, I mean, if you go to see a doctor for whatever, a primary care doctor, or even a specialist, how much time do you spend with them? Maybe if you're lucky, 10 minutes.
Yeah.
You're in, you're out. You spend more time with the nurse getting you in the room. That did not satisfy me, but I think it's important to understand physiology and anatomy. But a book that I read as my original goal was to be a children's author. And I thought if I'm going to write children's books, I better learn how they tick. So I started taking child psychology courses, and I found out I love that more than writing. So I read this book called The Magic Years by Selma Freiberg. It's a very interesting book. It's a dated book now, but it talked about psychiatry and children, and it really opened my eyes to behavioral science. And I've never lost interest with it. It's another one of those things you cannot stay on top of. The developments are so rapid now, especially with technology, MRIs and the sharing of information internationally. It's impossible to stay on top of it.
Yeah.
But I enjoy more in-depth conversations with people. I enjoy honesty and sincerity, and seeing people change and reach their goals.
Yeah. So you also have a podcast. So tell us about your podcast.
The podcast was suggested to me. It wasn't my idea. I have a relative who does crime scene cleanup in South Carolina. She has had that business for several years and knows my background, and said, you're a psychologist and you've quote survived a homicide. That sounds like a strange term, but that's how it's called. You survived a homicide, so why not do a podcast about that? There isn't one like that out there. And I didn't jump on the idea because I didn't know much about the technology side of it, how to. And again, I live in a rural area with lousy internet connection, so that was a factor. But I talked to a few other people that did it, and I found them extremely supportive, very helpful. And one thing led to another. And I thought, well, I'll put my toe in it and try it for a year and see how I feel about it. And much to my surprise, it was easier than I thought, given the advancements in Zoom. And I found a studio in town that I can rent with good internet access. And it just kind of unfolded easily. And for me, the biggest incentive to keep plugging away at it is I meet such interesting, resilient people that have been through what I've been through, which is it was a first for me. I've never had so many conversations with other people who were faced with the consequences of murder as I have in the last year and a half. And it's been very gratifying. I'm totally impressed with the people I interview. They come from all walks of life. They resolve the disparity between their old life and their new life in such unique ways. And they're very determined people. They're making good come out of a bad situation. And that definitely keeps me going and makes me want to continue the podcast, which is now in 11 countries.
So your podcast is about murder, right?
It's about the consequences of murder on those that survive it.
Okay. And your husband was murdered, correct?
Right.
I'm so sorry for your loss on that. I'm sure that was traumatic.
It was not only shocking, but the media treatment was equally shocking and equally difficult and relentless, relentless. I mean, just one example would be that they intruded into the funeral with their cameras and their bright lights and notepads, despite repeated cautions from me ahead of time to the undertaker, do not let them in. Do not. I don't want them here. They don't belong here. This is private property. In spite of my going there early to set the stage for that, he let them in by the truckload. And there was 300 people there. I'd say of that number, maybe 20 of them were reporters, and they were very intrusive to the point where I left early. They were just relentless, and they did not give up. So that was a double whammy. It wasn't just the murder, it was the media presence. They have no boundaries.
It was like trauma on top of trauma.
Yeah, it's re-victimization, and you're but a story to them, and a byline, and they're very intrusive. They went by my house, they took photographs, they knocked on the door, they came to my office, they were outside waiting at the morgue when I had to identify them, even though it was a Sunday at 6:30 in the morning.
Yeah.
So it wasn't that added to it.
So what was the story? Why was your husband murdered? Was it something someone had against him? Was it random or what?
It was not random. He had befriended, it's a long story, but he had befriended two very sketchy people in the inner city and started supporting their lifestyle with cash. He ran out. They didn't accept that explanation, and they clubbed him to death with a baseball bat and then dismembered him. And then they threw his body parts on the freeway.
Wow.
So that's why the media picked up on it and made a big deal about it, because it was pretty gruesome, even by Detroit standards.
Yeah. So did they catch and punish the people? Okay.
There was a third party involved that helped conceal the identifiable body parts up in northern Michigan, in Petoskey, by the name of Frank McMaster. He came forward and wanted immunity from prosecution in exchange for leading them to those identifiable body parts, in which they made good on their promise and did. And because of that, they were the two who were involved, which was John Carl Fry and Dawn Marie Spence, were both convicted. He got life in prison without the opportunity of getting parole, but he died in 5 years of Hep C. So he wasn't there long. And she got out in, I don't know, 6 months.
Wow.
She was out before I could sell my house.
That's quite a story.
It's like living somebody else's life. Let me tell you.
Sounds like some TV movie you'd see. And
now
the people that you talk to on your show, they've had similar experiences. I mean, they've had.
Yes, some of them have lost more than one person to homicide. There was a young woman from Korea. She's Korean American, and her younger sister's boyfriend did not accept breaking up with her younger sister. And my guest was in college, so she was not present in the home at the time when he busted in. And I don't know what you call those things. They're like plastic handcuffs that bind your hands. I don't know the name for them, but he took those and bound them to different faucets in the house and tortured them and killed the sister and the mother. And she found them later. There's just been one story after another. I mean, I talked to sometimes mass homicide victims. I talked to a doctor who was in the Route 99 Harvest Festival massacre in Las Vegas a few years back and lost her husband. And it happens. What I have found, I went, after the first year of my podcast, I went and re-listened to every episode back to back to back. And what I was trying to do was to figure out, is there any common denominator in these interviews? Is there anything that they frequently speak about or experience? And what I discovered after I listened to hours back to back was that the murder itself was very unique, but not the aftermath. The aftermath was fairly predictable in terms of the stigma that they experienced, in terms of the anxiety, the physical ramifications, the treatment from law enforcement, the treatment from the court system. It is, I mean, we could do a whole show on the myths about homicide that's perpetuated in the media. It's just a very different experience when you go through it. Just one example would be that the courts do not want homicide survivors in the courtroom. If you're the widow or the mother of a child who's died or the spouse of something, they do not want you there. Prosecutor or defense attorney, you're supposed to be out. They don't, because it's a distraction. They feel that they don't want to deal with you. In fact, I had my prosecuting attorney in my case, and many people have echoed the same thing, has said to me, this case doesn't belong to you. This case belongs to Wayne County and the state of Michigan.
Wow.
And I said, I don't see it that way. I said, who's going to be cleaning out his clothes closet? Who's going to be figuring out a burial? Who's going to be having to answer cards and letters about his death? Is it going to be you? Are you going to have to file the life insurance policy and clean out deposit boxes? I don't think so. But we never saw eye to eye on that. And they just look at it as it belongs to the state. And you're a nuisance. You're not wanted in the courtroom. And the other myth about that is that it's portrayed in movies that the court case gives you closure, which is a bunch of BS. That is so not true. I haven't had one person tell me that, and I agree with them. It's just the beginning. It's just one phase, one step in the whole process, and you don't feel closure from it. Matter of fact, I did not even go to the trial. I didn't want any part of it because nothing in my life would change, no matter the outcome.
Yeah.
I'd still be a widow. I still have to sell a house. I still have the media. I'd still be in debt from the money he gave to these people. That wasn't going to change any of that. So why go and be on camera more?
So do you still have to pay money to those people?
No, it was money that he went into debt to pay them money. My
Yeah.
husband did. He was supporting their lifestyle. And
Yeah.
we were in 1985 dollars. I discovered after his death, we were $30,000 in debt, which is about $90,000 today.
Yeah.
We were behind in taxes, mortgage, office rent, car payments, you name it, medical insurance. And I had to dig myself out of that. And my house was devalued because Michigan law then and now states if you had a serious crime involving the owner of the house, even if the crime did not occur on their property, you have to disclose that to a potential buyer. Because if they're superstitious and you do not tell them ahead of time, they can rescind the offer at any time, the purchase at any time in the future. So that devalued the house considerably. So everywhere I turned, there was an issue, and financially it was a nightmare. So I had to really that took me years to dig myself out of that.
So your book is a true story about all of this you're talking about?
Yes, but what I wanted to do in writing the book and why it took so long to write it, I waited 30 years, was that I want to make this point clear. I did not want to write the book for catharsis. I did not want to write the book to get closure. That's an assumption a lot of people make, because I feel that's using the reader for your own benefit. That's not a reason to write a book. I wanted to write a book to use my story as a launching pad or a place to begin to explain the experience of being a homicide survivor as for many people, what their experience is, what our shared experience is like, so that the reader could look in and using my example, but understand the broader picture, because there are so few resources out there. You'll occasionally find a book written about by a family member about a death in the family, a murder in the family, but they're not trained in psychology. And sometimes you'll find books written by psychologists about homicide, but they've never experienced it. And so I thought I could bring those two together and do a better job of explaining this subjectively and objectively. That was my goal, to add to the very little literature that is out there on this topic, as well as the podcast. There's, if you think of true crime podcasts, what do you think of? They're dramatizations and filled with gore, and it's about the perpetrator. It's as if the deceased lives in a vacuum.
Yeah.
If you think about Ted Bundy, for example, many people can say who his victims were, at least a few names, but how many people can speak to their families and the repercussions of those homicides on the mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers of the women he tortured and killed? I bet you nobody can do that.
So
that's not the focus.
It sounds like it's something you never really get over or get through.
You can improve, you can adapt, you can weave your life around it and grow around it. There are certain things that you just have to carry. You can't really undo it, but that doesn't mean you can't find joy again. It doesn't mean you can't go back to work or get your health restored. You can. 60% of people do not stay stuck. 40%, so much depends upon, previous trauma, genetics, resources, physical problems. There's a lot of variables. And if you're an individual with chronic pain, with few resources, who's been burglarized, and you're living in an isolated life, you're going to have a much tougher time of it than somebody without those drawbacks. So It's not an even playing field out there. And like I said, some people I've spoken with have had more than one murder. There was another woman I spoke with from Sells, Arizona, whose sister was murdered and then her brother was murdered in 2 years apart. So there's all kinds of variables which can create more difficult time in getting back on your feet. But I would say that you never go back to baseline ever.
Yeah, that's understood. So what's the name of your book?
What's the what with my book?
What's the name of your book?
Oh, A Life Divided.
Okay.
And it's now in print and Kindle. And I had last year I finished the audiobook version. I had an audio engineer from Detroit call me up. He had read the book, loved it, and said, I want to do your audiobook with you for free.
Wow.
And all you got to do is fly out here and we'll do it. And I did. And we worked on it for 3 weeks. We got it done. I didn't realize how dehydrating an audiobook is to do. That was my biggest challenge. But he was very professional, very helpful, very supportive. And so that came out, I think, in January or thereabouts. And one of my positive memories of that was that I was on a talk show about a month ago and I had a call in. It was a call-in kind of talk show. And this very anxious sounding man asked if it was available on audiobook. And I said, yes. And he said he was really grateful because he was blind and he would not been able to read it otherwise.
Yeah.
And I frankly, never thought about that, so I was glad to hear that.
Yeah, audiobooks are a big thing now.
They are.
Yeah. Well, you certainly have an interesting story and you certainly had an interesting life and still do. And I thank you for sharing some time with me today and I wish you all the best.
Thank you. Same to you.
And folks, be sure and check out the book, A Life Divided, correct?
Correct. And then the podcast is called Domino Effect of Murder.
Domino Effect of Murder. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Jan, for being my guest. Folks, thanks for tuning in to Holding On with Holder. Please subscribe to my channel and feel free to share this video all over social media. Jan, I will let you go. And thanks again for being my guest. And I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Bye-bye.